It's not that Gaza was the main issue of the election. It's that Gaza swung the election. When we talk about the impact of Gaza, or indeed the impact of the Muslim vote, and here when I talk about the Muslim vote, I don't just mean the Muslims. I don't just mean the Muslims. I don't just mean the Muslims. I mean non-Muslims also moved by the genocide that was taking place and perpetrated by Biden and Harris.
By now, you've probably heard a lot of people say that Donald Trump won the 2024 election in a landslide victory. But what if I told you it wasn't actually a landslide?
Right now, that everybody's wrestling over the narrative.
There are two groups that are trying to argue today that Gaza did not have an impact. The one are the Zionists, and two, in my opinion, and I don't mean this to deride them, pro-Harris Muslims who
politically correct. We want to be politically correct.
Esa. Okay. Esa? Yes.
Esa Galloway.
Esa Galloway.
Esa Galloway.
Esa Galloway, convert to Islam, defines the mission.
Kind of a show that will put people on the edge of their seats.
Because it leads to the future, a more sophisticated approach.
What is up, y'all? Welcome back to the show. Oh my goodness, you guys don't know how exciting it is to say welcome back to the show. I never in a million years thought that a little YouTube channel I started just over a week ago, just to get things off my chest, would have kind of gotten to 5,000 views already and over 100 subscribers. Thank you guys so much for that. It is so important to me that I make a few things clear on the channel. You'll notice the lighting's a little different, and I'm going to be trying to make incremental improvements with every video. That's my commitment to you. And I want to again say thank you. Thank you so much, because you guys went all out. You gave me likes and subscriptions. Then on top of that, you also let me know what you were thinking about my content. And please send your frenemies over here. All are welcome. I want to know the good, the bad, the ugly, everything about the content I'm making for you, because I want to build a community where we're not afraid to go deep into the topics, explore them with nuance. And I don't want to be in a situation where I ever have what's called audience capture, where I'm trying to pander to my audience to keep you guys. What I want to do, and my commitment to you, besides making each video incrementally better, is I also want you to know I will always give you what I think. When I make a mistake, I'm going to call that out. When I get it wrong, I'm going to call that out also. But we're going to actually try to cultivate some critical thinking and embracing of nuance on this channel. So thank you again for everyone who commented. Almost most importantly, maybe even more importantly than the Patreon link I just added to the description of the video below. So if you want to support my work, help me put videos out more frequently, and help grow this channel, you can donate at Patreon. But probably more importantly, especially at this stage, is if you share this video. I think the reason I got up to 5,000 views so quickly is because you guys were talking about and sharing the content I did in the last video with your friends. So thank you again so much for that. I can't thank you guys enough. And I want to get into our content without further ado. What I'm saying here is this will be my final word on the Muslim vote. And the reason I say final word, quite honestly, at this point, it almost doesn't matter anymore. Trump won. We're about 2 months away from him assuming office and starting to implement his agenda. We're getting leaks on his cabinet picks and all the things that are happening right now. So we have very limited time. We're once again, as a community, as a nation, behind the 8 ball, trying to figure out how we're going to do a few things. And that brings me to why this channel exists in the first place. If you look at my slogan underneath the logo, it starts off saying liberty. One of the things that I'm so passionate about, I've been an activist for well over 20 years, is to preserve the First Amendment, to preserve the Bill of Rights. I think, that is the secret sauce of America if we can live up to our highest values. Then I want to explore issues about identity, and that's why the Muslim vote here is still so important. In the last video, we did a real deep dive on the conversation and on the different angles and motivations that Muslims might have been going into the ballot box with. Now we have some data. We'll probably never have definitive data on how Muslims voted just because of how diverse our community is and how complex the situation is to try to figure out if there is some major common theme on how voting was happening. But because it is an issue of identity, and identity directly translates to how we do civics, understanding who we are helps us understand, are we asking the right questions? Are we grounding ourselves in what we believe? Are we wearing our faith community identity? And when do we oscillate between that and other identities that we may have? I think that's such an important conversation, and this Muslim vote identity question gets really into it. And also, I think that for the non Muslims watching, this helps you inform yourself about who your Muslim neighbors are, how diverse they are, how really in a way they're a lot like you, and where the differences might be. So I think this is a great subject to keep talking about. And in the introduction, you saw how Imam Tom, once again, giving props to him because he called it how it is. You know, everyone's wrestling over the narrative. I call it narrative building. And what they're trying to do is establish themes that will help empower them as they move forward. So, like when you saw Mehdi Hasan talking about it wasn't a landslide victory for Trump, I encourage you to go back and watch the full video at his website and channel Zateo, because the reason he's discounting this idea of a landslide, yes, for sure, the Republicans, for the first time in God knows how long, won the popular vote and the Electoral College. And that's incredibly notable. But the reason he doesn't want people to think of it as a landslide is because when you think that you have this overwhelming wave of support coming into office, then you think also that these people have a mandate from the voters. And the reality is, now that the numbers have come in, now that the votes have been counted, we really kind of see it's really sort of a 49, maybe 48% split between Republicans and Democrats. So it's a lot closer than the actual election results let us know when it comes to the overall popular vote. And that becomes very important for if we're going to agree or disagree with MAGA and the agenda that they'll be bringing to us in 2 months, and how we either push forward with some of those things or work to push back against some of those agenda items that they'll have, things from Project 2025 all the way down to all the headlines that we're seeing. Another thing that's so important about this discussion around the Muslim vote is trust in political parties, because I think that that is a major theme for how we can move forward uh, as a community. Now, again, I said this is my final word on it. I did want to point out one last thing. You'll notice a big pivot from Brother Sami in the very opening of the clip. He said, when I speak about the Muslim vote, I include, and he means everyone that was influenced by the terrible genocide happening in Gaza. And I think that while it seems kind of like a strategic move to be narrative building, and to make his case, it's actually a very good thing that we're transferring away from this idea of the Muslim community could have cost Kamala the election to the genocide costed Kamala the election. And the reason why is going back to how we see ourselves. If we're a diverse community and we're a community of faith, a community of values, then what happens when we put forward a value of being anti-genocide, being pro preservation of life, especially in a war zone? Then all of a sudden, we become a community that works with other communities that share our values. And that becomes a force amplifier. And I think that's the strategy we really got to look at when we're moving forward. Now, before we get into two serious topics, I want to get into some clips that are in the beginning kind of funny. This is a clip from The Onion. It's not a real newscast, but it sure looks like one. And then we're going to get into a deep dive around issues we didn't talk about in the last video on the Muslim vote. All right, here we go.
Well, votes are still pouring in, still being counted, but still a little too early to tell exactly which minority will be the scapegoat in this election. Low African American turnout, obviously a popular excuse for Democrats, but they just don't have the data that they really need to be able to blame them, at least not yet. But the night is young. Plenty of groups are still out there. You have young voters, old voters, Asian voters, all still in play. Muslims, Cubans, certainly the list goes on. And some minority will be to blame tonight.
This was the first time that I had voted without going straight down the Democratic ticket.
Don't take us for granted. Don't take our support for granted. Our blood is not cheap.
They showed the world that they would rather continue a genocide than defeat someone who they claimed was a fascist.
There was so much naysaying. The same things that you're hearing now about the Muslim vote doesn't matter. you guys are wrong. You don't know what you're doing. The math doesn't work out. You don't have the numbers.
It doesn't help us.
Not an accusation.
We have to acknowledge reality if we're going to resist. We can't pretend it isn't what it is.
Okay, guys, I want to get back into talking to you a little bit about this notion of recognizing reality. And the reason for that is, again, I think everyone came at this with a good intention, whether people actually from the faith community wanted to vote for Kamala, like I said in the last video, as a harm reduction measure, or people who wanted to punish Democrats voted for Trump, or people who had different kinds of strategies like vote swapping and split ticket voting like I was advocating for. I think all of us were trying to do what we could to basically help our brothers and sisters in Gaza, but at the same time, not have to live with a moral decision that disgusted us. Being able to have as clear a conscience as possible, being that there were no really good options, so that on the day of judgment, when we meet our Maker, we can say we tried. Now, the thing about that that makes this incredibly important is that the theme I'm going to try to bring forward here is not only how diverse the American Muslim community is and adjacent communities, but how interrelated we all are. And if we're that interrelated, why would we have to only have one political strategy, or one political strategy that may or may not be based on reality or based on something that can be sustainable? I think I said this in the last video, but I think it bears repeating. The primaries, when they were putting Joe Biden and the Democrat Party wanted him to be the front runner for the last election before this one, they changed the order of which states came first so that they could give him a boost so that he could be like on his on the path to defeating Bernie and becoming the nominee. So if they're willing, the Democrat Party is willing to make major changes and offend an entire state by changing the order of the primaries, you can bet your bottom dollar that 4 years from now, in another presidential election, if they think that having a large Muslim and Arab population in Michigan is a problem, they're going to work towards that. So all of these ideas of how our community has power and when, we have to start thinking in a more sophisticated way when it comes to those issues. Now, I want to get back into the video because we have some fantastic clips to get into. So here we go.
This is about Muslim voters, Muslim Americans. Back in 2020, 93% for Joe Biden, 7% for Trump. This time around, 53% for Jill Stein, 21% for Trump, and 20% for Kamala Harris.
And number one, that was a bogus. That's not a poll at all. The demographics of it don't match. Look, from the group that did it, 53% for Jill Stein. If there are 2.5 million registered Muslim voters, which is what that group says there are, and 60% of them turned out, which is 1.5 million. 53% of them is 100,000 votes more than Jill Stein actually got in the hard count.
So this is so important because I was saying earlier that we need to base our political strategies on reality. Now, I worked for the organization that put that poll out. It's called CARE. I was one of the people who helped establish the Houston chapter. I was their founding executive director in the aftermath of 9/11 in 2002. And so I just want you to know that I'm not coming at this with hard feelings. I have a lot of respect for the work that CARE does. And I think that, again, this should be a yes and approach. People have narrative building exercises that they're doing. So they wanted to show that the American Muslim vote was going towards Dr. Stein. Again, I totally agreed with that. My vote was for Dr. Stein as a protest vote. But the point here is that we have to always stay grounded in what the facts are, no matter if it kind of blows up a narrative. It's much better when you're analyzing a situation to know that, like, if you have a map and the maps of Texas and then you find yourself in Arkansas, the map's useless. So let's build strategies on reality and not beat that horse anymore.
As a Muslim American, I think it's really important not to talk about the Muslim American vote as a monolithic vote.
The Arab American vote. Arab Americans, a majority of Arab Americans are not Muslim, and the majority of Muslims are not Arab. And so there are two distinct communities.
There's been a lot of attention on the Arab and Muslim vote And while I think that's important because of certain concentrations of the Arab and Muslim community in particular places like Michigan where they could have an outsized impact, that's not the only place and way that Gaza had an impact on this election. And I think it did. And we should be clear, no one issue determined the outcome of this election, but several issues combined helped push it in one direction.
Yeah, so you're going to see that as a common theme. And in fact, even the people who were trying to center the Muslim vote as the punishment or the factor that caused Kamala Harris to lose and the Democrat Party not to be in power at the presidential level, they also have now admitted and have started to rationalize how Gaza was maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, and that it wasn't the big issue of the election, but the crucial issue of the election. And again, this pivot from the American Muslim vote and our particular power to the genocide happening and it being such a moral conundrum is actually something that, again, I think is incredibly positive because, one, it builds on the goodwill and good faith of people of conscience, and it doesn't, it allows our community to be a part of a larger movement for justice rather than us trying to say, we cost her the election and now we're dealing with Trump and all of y'all have to deal with Trump and anything he does to y'all because we caused that, then by default, logically, it becomes our fault that other communities could be suffering. And this is a huge fissure. We're going to get into age and how the age break happens for how people vote a little later in the video, but pin that in your mind as we go forward.
Gaza does, in fact, loom large. Given the fact that we've been polling now for 30 years with Arab Americans, and we've always seen a Democratic edge, but from the second Bush term through the Biden election, they were 2-1 Democrat.
Just for those who don't know, this is James Zogby. He is the head of a polling firm that, again, he's had over 30 years of research on the Arab American community. Very scientific, very reliable. He is not a Muslim. He is an Arab and may or may not have the same type of passion that the youth have for the genocide in Gaza. But what I'm telling you here is that he's giving us an objective look where, I think in other comments in this very same video, I didn't cut it out for you guys to see, he has some animosity towards the third party. But other than that, he tends to be very objective and very fact-based.
And that is no longer the case. In simply a 4-year period, there was a collapse. Now, why would there be that quick a collapse? Partly it's Gaza, but I think it's also that what you have is, in America, a very weak party ID system right now. It's not like in UK where you're a member of the Tory party or a member of the Labour Party. Being a member of the Democratic or Republican Party means you're on a mailing list, a phone call list, the email list. You get begging, we need your money before midnight, blah, blah, blah.
So this is actually incredibly important because I've been a political independent my entire life. I've never affiliated with either party officially. However, one of my emails got adopted by the DNC, and not only every day coming up to the election, but every day since the election, I have been getting Harris Waltz pleas for money up until today. Today is the 20th, and I'm still getting emails. $5. What can we say? Give us some money. It's like, oh my God, you raised $1 billion. I know you're in debt, but stop asking me. You wouldn't, and you basically ran your campaign to satisfy your donor class. So stop coming to someone like me for $5. I mean, my goodness.
There's no organizational structure, so party ID is weak. That translates in an interesting way so that older voters, for example, are Democrat or Republican. They're not going anywhere. When we look at the polling in Pennsylvania, for example, Arab Americans in Pennsylvania, Democrats win. When you look at the polling in Michigan, Democrats are in trouble because it's a more immigrant population in Michigan. In Pennsylvania, it's a more settled population of folks who've been there for generations, and they have a stronger identification with the Democrat. Come hell or high water, they're voting Democrat.
See, this is exactly the same dynamic that I see within my own family. My in-laws happen to be African American. Obviously, they're one generation ahead of me, and they are die-hard Democrats. They couldn't see why anybody would vote for anyone other than a Democrat. And I think that what Dr. Zogby is saying here reflects that same dynamic across many communities. So just keep in mind this whole factor of the youth versus previous generations, because it becomes a really big issue soon.
Union people, et cetera. So there's a drop in the Democrat support base among, in particular, the more recent immigrants, but also among young people who are a very large component of the Arab American community.
By the way, Arab American voters are diverse. They're not monolithic. They don't just vote on one issue. And you know what? There's a lot of Palestinian Americans in Chicago as well, and that went solidly for Harris. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways to look at this.
In the Arab community, what you got was a more even split between Trump and Harris. That's not enough because Joe Biden got 60% of that vote, and Donald Trump got a little over 30%. He beat Trump 2-1. If Harris had beaten Trump 2-1, she might have won Michigan.
Now, see, winning Michigan would have been hugely important. And again, the early abandon Biden, abandon Harris campaign, and again, all respect to them. What they pulled off was amazing. How they mobilized people, how they, in just less than a year's time, built this incredible movement that was very, very effective. The issue here, though, is because Trump had a sweep of all the swing states, that winning Michigan would not have been enough. And then, as you see, we're going into all these different ways of slicing up the Arab and Muslim community, from age to region to different political affiliations, and then to different moral and other types of value concerns.
With Arab American votes. As it was, she lost 60, 70,000 Arab American voters statewide, coupled with students and others who stayed home or also voted for other candidates, and you got the loss. In the polling we do of U.S. numbers, we find that the constituencies most impacted by Gaza are young people and non-white voters, Black, Asian, and Latino. For example, if you ask about how they feel about what Israel's doing, 2/3 of young people and non-white voters are opposed, whereas other voters are in a very different camp on that. So when you look at Democrats overall, having a majority of them opposed to Israel, that majority is being driven by young voters. And
this is incredibly important, because young voters and non-white voters also tend to be a little more fickle on reliability for coming to vote. So when you see polls that say reliable voters, that's actually kind of saying these are people who tend to always show up, where the youth and non-white voters tend to show up at different and varying rates. So it's one of the reasons that you could theorize that the Harris campaign did not embrace a ceasefire or make any progress on that area, is just because we have to build our civic participation record.
And non-white voters.
Quote, the Democrats are giving all the money in the war. Quote, either side will go ahead and send bombs from here to kill my brothers and sisters. Quote, you can't say you're a Democrat and stand for the genocide that's going on in Gaza, period. This actually echoes what AOC heard from her own constituents who had backed her and Trump on the same ballot. Number of these AOC Trump voters.
Real quick, before we get into the people who voted both for AOC and for Trump, this is kind of a deep dive that Breaking Points is doing on New York voters who are kind of a microcosm for a way to explore the impact of the Gaza issue and the genocide on the election. And what we're finding is that there's a political realignment happening. There's people who are, like I suggested in the last video, whether they heard from me or not, of course they didn't, they're in New York, but they're actually voting split ticket. They're saying Trump at the top, AOC for Congress. And it's an interesting dynamic that people are now starting, instead of voting straight ticket, they're starting to vote for their values in a lot more attentive way, which is, again, a huge positive sign that the electorate is thinking this way. So that first set that she was talking about, quote this, quote that, those were responses to a mayoral candidate going out asking people why and how they voted, and then why, which is kind of novel because it's very rare that people listen to the voters. Instead, we normally have the DNC blaming the voters for how voters act and talking down to us for not knowing, like what is good for us, essentially.
Said they felt she and Trump were both authentic or anti-establishment. But again, Gaza came up a number of times in these responses. Quote, voted for Trump and you, not genocide Harris. Democrats became the party that supports war, and simply because of Gaza. None of this is scientific, of course, but there are some other indications that Gaza really was a significant part of Kamala Harris's loss. The Palestinian American who was blocked from speaking at the DNC actually improved her winning margin in her Georgia State House district. As she wrote on Twitter, quote, maybe, just maybe, voters appreciate when you speak out for the things you truly believe in. Perhaps discuss.
Now, I just want to give a shout out to Representative Ruah Roman. I'm a huge fan. Love the fact that you did vote swapping yourself and that you kind of found a very clever way to balance the presidential election. And major props here to you for how you handled your own reelection campaign. So if you do get to see this, I do want you on the show, and I hope to make that interview happen as soon as possible.
Over Gaza really was a significant and perhaps determinative factor in this election, something even I didn't anticipate. In a lot of ways, Gaza is emblematic of democratic hypocrisy, moral collapse, and working class disengagement.
Those are just lowly House Democrats. How will the head of their party, the outgoing president, man the ramparts during this challenging and fraught peaceful transition to fascism?
Well, Mr. President-elect and former President and Donald, congratulations. And looking forward to having, like we said, a smooth transition. Do everything we can to make sure you're accommodating what you need.
So we literally call Donald Trump Hitler. We say all of these crazy things about not only him, but what he represents, the agenda he's going to bring in, on and on and on. And then you're going to give him everything he needs. You have people from Morning Joe Scarborough, going out to meet him when they were like the leaders of the resistance in the past. I think you're seeing a lot of hypocrisy coming both from the Democratic Party, but also the media in general. So a big problem with that is that people are now starting not to trust the system. And when no one trusts civics, then everything breaks down. And that is an incredibly dangerous place to be as a society, when people have no faith in the government. And then what does that leave us to do? Now, there's obviously a difference between, for instance, not participating electorally and what role and what real impact does electoral politics actually have. There's a huge debate over that, and we can dive into that at another time. But what I'm trying to say here is people are now, they've even called it a post-truth world that we live in, because everyone is so siloed in their own echo chambers that people don't understand each other. It's one of the reasons at work the other day, I was asking and talking to people just kind of about like the future of the country. And one of the people were like, yeah, it just bothers me that so many college students are pro-terrorist. And I was like shocked. I didn't know at first. I didn't put two and two together that he was talking about the protests against the Gaza genocide on college campuses. So we have to do as much as we can to be a community that bridges gaps.
Did you get a chance to vote on Tuesday?
I didn't vote.
And why did you not vote?
Because I don't believe in the system anymore.
I argue that decades of revolutionary change, the massive expansion of globalization, the information revolution, have upended our politics. We're seeing a realignment in which the old categories of economic status and race are giving way to new categories like social status and cultural divides around gender. We are likely at the beginning of this transformation of the political landscape.
So this is so important here because, and you've probably all seen on Facebook or whatever social media platforms that you're on, they have the Chinese character for crisis, and then it also says it means opportunity. There's some truth to that, even though it's just kind of a meme. The idea here is, and I said in the last video, that the Muslim community's diversity can very much become our superpower, our strength. And this is because, again, the commonality that we have is our faith, but the fact of who we are as a community, we have every type of person, ethnically, racially, economically, uh, essentially, if there is a segment of American communities other than faith, you'll find Muslims in it because when you say other than faith, it's talking about all the other parts. Um, and this means that our community then can become a community that pulls people together on shared values and can take advantage of the political realignments that are happening, and also become a community that can help people hear one another and break those echo chambers that we find ourselves in.
How many young people stayed home? How many Muslims switched to Trump in a vain hope that he'd make good on his pandering? Trump didn't deserve to win and has already nominated a bunch of neocon, warhawk, Israel for psychos to key foreign policy positions.
Okay, now this is really important. I want you guys to take a look at this right here and see this report. We're going to see some video that backs this up in a minute, but there are reports coming out of Israel that have said that Trump has already said his first day in office, he's going to completely unrestrict all the aid, military aid and restrictions to allow Israel to quote unquote finish the job. Now, another thing here, I want to tell you a little bit about this picture after we see the video. That's me with the little red circle around my face more than 20 years ago. So I look a little different, but I'm standing behind then Texas Governor Rick Perry, who was signing some legislation into law that a close friend of mine spearheaded out of Dallas. And this legislation was fantastic because it was passed and first introduced and then worked through the system and passed in the buildup to the second Iraq War. And why is that so significant? It gave the Muslim community a win right before we faced all of this extra backlash because this was post 9/11 and war on terror and the invasion of Iraq. The bill was simple. It was a consumer protection bill, basically saying if something was labeled halal, it actually had to be certified. It was basically a copy of the kosher bill that was in the books in Texas protecting the Jewish community. Now, I want to go back to the video because I want to show why this picture is so important.
My feelings personally, and I'm speaking only as a person, I think Israel would only be acting on the property it already owns. I think Israel has title deed to Judea and Samaria. There are certain words I refuse to use. There is no such thing as a West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as a settlement. They're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're cities. There's no such thing as an occupation.
This is the guy that Trump is sending to be the ambassador to Israel. So he made all those promises to our community. I tried in the last video to show what allies to Israel were saying. Again, we got 2 months to see what happens, but Huckabee was the name that was floated.
Basically, I mean, there really is no such thing as, and I have to be careful in saying this, because people really get upset. There's really no such thing as a Palestinian. There's not, they're Persians. You know, there's such complexity within that. There's really no such thing. That's been a political tool to try to force land away from Israel.
One of my favorite, and I hate to say it like that based off of how disgusting saying that there's no such thing as a Palestinian is, but one of the favorite responses I've had when I've been in interfaith circles and this kind of rhetoric comes up is my Palestinian friends just stand up and say, I guess I'm invisible. Can y'all hear me? And after a while, the point is made and it's very effective. But again, you're seeing views of Mike Huckabee. And the reason why this is so important is that he is quite literally a very far right end times evangelical who literally thinks that he has to shepherd in the new or rebuilt temple in Jerusalem and establish the nation of Israel in order to start the rapture. Let's keep going.
The two-state solution, if we mean two governments holding the same piece of real estate, is irrational and unworkable. If there is a two-state solution, the Palestinian state needs to be outside the boundaries of the nation of Israel. There's plenty of land in the world that we could find a place and say, okay, let's create a Palestinian state.
And he's not the only one who thinks this way that Trump's appointing.
And there's no reason why the miracle of the reestablishment of the temple on the Temple Mount is not possible.
Did you catch that? The Temple Mount is the foundation of Masjid al-Aqsa. So what he's saying here is there's going to soon be a miracle where they rebuild the temple. What does that mean for Masjid al-Aqsa, the third holiest place in Islam, the place where the Prophet, peace be upon him, did the Miraj? How are we not incredibly alarmed here, people?
Whatever you do, whatever you want to do, whoever you want to go after, you have my blessing. So the real question there is whether Netanyahu decides to continue to try to expand that war.
Now we'll shift gears to what we're hearing out of the Middle East about Trump's re-election. Let's bring in Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Dan.
Before we bring in the Israeli ambassador, I want to go back to that image that I showed you. So here again, President Trump reportedly, we don't have video or confirmation, but this does come out of Israeli media, no restrictions on day one. And then back to this picture with former Texas Governor Perry. The reason I brought this picture up is not just to flex that, I've been an activist for a long time. That's a benefit, but not actually the purpose. While we were in there, as he was signing the legislation, he decided to tell us a story, and it was very curious. He told us about how he has ownership and interest in the cattle industry. And then he specifically said that he helps breed and ship red cows to Israel. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I thought it was really peculiar. So I went home. This is before, over 20 years ago, before the explosion of videos and stuff on YouTube. So I had to look it up, and I found the whole idea here is the sacrificial animal in order to rebuild the temple is supposed to be a red cow with no blemish from the land of Israel. So I'm putting two and two together. I'm pretty sure what Governor Perry was telling us while he's signing a bill on how to slaughter animals for Muslims to have halal meat in Texas, that he's like, I'm signing this for you, but you should know that I'm sending red cows to Israel so that a perfectly red without blemish cow can be slaughtered in Israel when we rebuild the temple. I find that to be incredibly wild. You're going to have to take my word on this because I was in the room. I heard the story. Let's get back into the video.
Danny Danon, it's great to have you on the show, Danny. I want to know quickly what you think of Leon Panetta. They're saying, you know what Trump's just going to do? He's going to give Benjamin Netanyahu everything he wants, no questions asked.
Thank you for having me, Trace. We congratulated President Trump for the victory, and we are looking forward to continue the strong bond with the United States. We share the same values, the same future, also the same enemies.
The same values, the same future, the same enemies. Remember, the context of this clip is that Trump's going to give everything without restriction to Israel. And a lot of the political analysis that I have been reading that I think is very compelling is that Netanyahu wants to expand the war to include a full-on war with Iran, with America actively fighting, meaning boots on the ground, American troops, and American power directly and kinetically engaged against Iran, not supporting Israel where Israel fights Iran. So this becomes incredibly alarming because Trump ran as the anti-war president, the pro-peace president. This is troubling signs.
And I believe that the president and his new team will support us when we fight evil. We have so many fronts, but it all goes to Iran. So I think the main question is who will be sitting next to the president dealing with the Iranian question, because all the problems we have today in the Middle East, it all comes from Tehran.
Now that Republicans are in power, you're going to see a lot of folks saying a lot of lefty-sounding things because there's no ability for them to actually put them into effect.
Okay. This is incredibly important, this point that former press secretary of Bernie Sanders during his presidential campaign and now a podcaster at the Bad Faith podcast, Brianna Joy Gray, is pointing out that because we have a Republican trifecta again, that we're going to see Democrats and resistance people be a lot more bold than they were under the Democrats and the Democratic Biden administration on fighting injustice. But one of the reasons is how performative is it? Do they really mean it, or are they doing things that they know will fail just to build their brand, just to do what we talked about earlier, narrative building? Guys, we got to wisen up to who real friends are, people who do work for the long run, actually to make change, versus people who are just out there to build their own political career.
And it's good for brand building. We can anticipate that the progressives in the House are going to start talking about Medicare for all again, all because it doesn't put any pressure on the Democratic Party to actually execute because they aren't actually in power. So,
just real quick, remember, she was Bernie Sanders' press secretary.
Senator Bernie Sanders is trying to block the U.S. from sending any weapons to Israel. The independent senator introducing the joint resolutions of disapproval back in September. And today, he says he'll bring it to the Senate floor for a vote this week. The effort has been garnering attention from Democratic lawmakers and human rights groups. It is, however, unlikely to pass.
It is, however, unlikely to pass. So it's getting the effect, it's making the splash from human rights groups and different communities, but they're actually using a very obscure rule to force a vote and get it onto the Senate floor. And again, they would be happy if they could even get somewhere around 20 people to vote for it. Very, very far from what it would take to pass.
Clearly, what is happening in Gaza today is unspeakable. But what makes it even more painful is that much of what is happening there has been done with U.S. weapons and with American taxpayer support.
Now, the vote comes about 2 weeks after the Biden administration announced it had not determined that Israel is blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza.
Again, another ploy for public relations. Do you remember the 30-day letter that just happened to be after the election that said we could possibly do an arms embargo if you don't let the aid in? Well, if you've been watching the press secretary covering all this, he tap dances a lot and basically doesn't answer questions and doesn't say one way or the other if the government has determined whether Israel is letting aid in or not. So a lot of performative work here happening. I don't want to discredit it 100% because at least it helps the narrative get out that people hear what's happening. But at the end of the day, don't be fooled by people who pull off PR stunts that don't have any possibility of making actual change.
We can't just run to the right and make the same mistakes with the right that we made with the left. That would be also a huge mistake. Because some people are saying, oh, well, Muslims are more natural allies to the right. We got traditional values. I don't buy that. It's not that simple.
I totally agree with Imam Tom here. And I have kind of this love-hate relationship with this video that features Imam Tom on a Q&A because he gets so much right. But then there's a couple of little points there where I'm just like, okay, I understand the grand vision. You know, it's always awesome to think big. But in some ways, I feel like it's almost like putting the cart before the horse, and that the focus should be a lot on building local power and increasing civic participation from the Muslim community. And of course, there's two levels to that. You do have to have the big picture to motivate people, but at the same time, we don't want to be putting our strategy into such a grandiose way that we're kind of not even taken seriously.
We often have to leave our values at the door. They accept us for our identities, but they do not accept our values. And so now you've got a space, you show up to a protest or you show up to some sort of coalition work, and that space does not reflect your values. You can't even mobilize your community to come. So this entire arrangement needs to be rethought.
This is incredibly important because Imam Tom, again, is 100% accurate here. There's so many times where we have very important issues. We need Muslims to show up, and we are such a small community that we don't have the luxury of, picking our allies. But at the same time, our allies don't necessarily have the values at heart that we agree with, and sometimes even are trying to get us to change our values through kind of quid pro quo relationships. So what's really important here is rethinking how we do allyship. and not making it to where these are like binding contracts between different communities, but instead going back to our identity as a faith community and a community of values. So we stand on our values, and then that allows us to have limited partnerships with people when we have mutual interest, and then also to be the type of people that not only advocates for freedom of religion, but doesn't go into the trap of the far right, where the far Christian right, I mean, where you kind of weaponize freedom of religion in a way to put other people down. Very important distinguishing it, and we'll have some future episodes where we go into depth on that topic.
The attacks on Islam are literally the beginning, the tip of the spear for the attacks on everyone. So what will happen if they get enough Supreme Court justices in, the first thing they'll attack will be gay marriage and abortion, and they'll allow states to deal with it how they want. And then the second level of attack will be privileging religion in the state, putting one religion more over others. And you see this in Texas and in Tennessee with the textbook issues. They've actually, here in Texas, how many people saw the post that went viral where slaves were called workers in the McGraw-Hill textbooks in Texas? You saw that, right? That book is a direct result of when they attacked Islam in the textbooks, saying that Islam was treated too favorably. And then while everyone was debating the merits of Islam and the social studies standards, they took out Cesar Chavez, they took out Latino history, they took out Black history, they took out and justified the internment of Japanese people.
Okay, so that was a talk I gave, ironically enough, called The Trump Effect, back at the Texas Dawa Conference in Houston, Texas, right before Trump assumed office for the first time. So, my goodness, how we've come full circle. The one thing that I got wrong, and I wouldn't even say I got it wrong, is because times have changed. They didn't, of course, go after gay marriage, but now the way the Trump administration is going, they're going after the whole LGBTQ plus coalition, which would, of course, include gay marriage. And there are people in the Trump administration in Project 2025 that look at how to restrict and deal with the marriage issue. But the key point here is that they did go after abortion and they did take it to the states. What they're doing is playing federal versus local control. And if it's done appropriately, sometimes I think that could be an incredible healing way to handle certain issues and handle moral quandaries. But in a kind of the way that the far Christian right is doing it, it seems to me, and I think it's very clear, that many of them, if not most of them, are trying to establish a theocracy based on their beliefs of Christianity and making every other faith and every other community subservient to that. And this is where the emphasis on the First Amendment becomes so important, because the First Amendment doesn't discriminate on religion. Now, as a Muslim, no one is saying take bay'ah to the First Amendment. What we're saying is that your rights to practice Islam are guaranteed by and protected by the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. So we have to figure out how to balance that when it comes to activism and politics. But in our minds, we have to be very careful not to become constitutionalists to the point where we start compromising our moral clarity. This is why we have scholars. This is why we have Maqasid Sharia. This is why we have fiqh, because we will always turn to the pure sources of Islam for right and wrong, but how we adapt and how we strategize to use politics and to use civics to improve society, that has to be based on the rules that exist. And in our community's case, as less than 2% of the population, spread out and incredibly diverse, I think the best path forward is an embracing of the First Amendment as the first pass of how we start to empower ourselves as a community. Let's keep going.
So one thing we're really interested in is turning like the momentum into a movement.
Because I would like to point out that your point about local politics, I think, is right. And we saw that yesterday in the election. Sorry, we're recording on Wednesday. There were so many ballot measures that were quote unquote progressive, but just populist, that won in states where Donald Trump also won.
This is really important because earlier I talked about the political realignment. For those of you who don't know, ballot measures, like we have them here in Colorado, each state kind of does it a little bit differently, but it's a form of what's called direct democracy, where you can put law or potential law to be up for a vote by the people and not necessarily going through the legislative process of the state. And a lot of these things are incredibly strong and powerful agents of change that, again, are a form of direct democracy. So whether you agree with or disagree with electoral politics, there's all kinds of ways to be civically engaged and to be empowering yourself and your community depending on where you live. So the key point here, though, is that, again, people are looking at issues and not becoming party loyalist of either party, as Brianna is about to explain.
Paid sick leave passed in Arkansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, all states that went to Trump. Minimum wage and tipped worker wages passed in 4 states, Arkansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Arizona, all went to Trump. Proposed minimum wage increases, I think failed. Is that where it failed in California and Massachusetts? Okay, ignore that one.
Won't ignore that one because the interesting thing there was it was minimum wage hikes, but they failed in blue states where all the other things that would be considered progressive, or as Brianna said more accurately, populist, meaning it helps the working man, passed in red states. So again, this whole idea of left, right, and blue and red is becoming very blurred, and we have to get wise to that as we build strategy.
But there was also whatever got 57% of the vote in Florida, but didn't pass because there's a 60 vote threshold. But it doesn't mean that these things aren't popular. And all of those things, that reality got me thinking about 2020, when I remember harping on the fact that Florida passed a $15 minimum wage with 60% of the vote, even though Donald Trump obviously won in that state.
Media trust has hit a historic low. 4 out of 10 Americans say they completely lack trust in the media.
This is so important because earlier I mentioned that we live in a post-truth society. Everyone kind of has their own facts. And the sad thing about that is that our media landscape has also become so polarized. You go to MSNBC if you're on the left, you go to Fox News or other networks if you're on the right. And what's happening is no one has common information, let alone common facts, in order to have a conversation. And the thing about that is not only is our civics not being trusted, our politicians not being trusted, the Senate and the Congress having historic low approval ratings, and then for the first time ever, a president getting the popular vote and winning the Electoral College, not first time ever, but first time in recent memory. All of these things are showing that people are skeptical, people are waking up, people are thinking, but we have now, as the Muslim community, again, a huge opportunity through being active, through getting to know our neighbors, through showing up at city level meetings, to showing up at state level meetings, being a part of the school board, being a part of the city council, just becoming an outward facing community that's always looking for benefit can be hugely impactful because trust in the media and trust in higher level government are at all-time lows. So again, crisis does represent often opportunity, and we have to be wise and take advantage of that.
Something I found really interesting was the Washington Post did some polling on undecided voters in spring of this year. And what they found was when you ask the question, do you care about protecting democracy? A lot of those voters actually broke for Trump. And I think the reason for that is that phrase means different things to different voters. If you're a progressive voter, a Democratic voter, that probably means I'm concerned about Trump changing the structures of U.S. government or using authoritarian language. But if you're a conservative voter, a libertarian voter, an undecided voter, it might mean I'm concerned about the weaponization of the Department of Justice. I'm concerned about the government, they're receptive to the message that Trump says when he says, they're coming after me because I'm fighting for you.
This is so important for the American Muslim community because both of those concerns, whether the first ones that she laid out about the institutions of government being changed and weaponized, or the second one that the actual Justice Department is being weaponized, both of those have worked against the Muslim community in post 9/11 America. And also, these are things that we then have the ability to build relationships with people on all sides. In fact, a quick story about that. When I was a full-time lobbyist in Tennessee, I was able to build a coalition to defeat a bill that was called Forfeiture of Assets in a Case of Terrorism. Now, by the name alone, you would think that's a fantastic bill, that you would want to support it. The problem was it was model legislation that was part of the original anti-Sharia bill that then got piecemealed out when the First Amendment said this was unconstitutional. They started to put each little individual slice of that anti-Sharia legislation through to try to get it passed at state legislatures. And many state legislatures did pass it. But when it came to Tennessee, a Republican trifecta at the time, and still is, just like America is about to be, I was able to then build a coalition and get the bill changed, so much so that we endorsed it. What happened was I saw the bill, I read it. It didn't have protections for the asset owners. It didn't have any level of who could call something an act of terrorism. So it could be a municipality, it could be a media outlet, it could be the state government, the city government. And then forfeiture of assets, what that is it allows government to take property and then take the value of that property from the owners. So this idea of forfeiture of assets in a case of terrorism, some right-wing blog or some activist could say this mosque harbors terrorists inside, and then create a story, and then a city government could see that story and theoretically seize the property of the mosque, sell it, take the money, give it to the state, and then there's no more mosque there anymore. And that's kind of a very extreme way, but it also was the intent of that bill, because they would call anything that came through Sharia possibly an act of terrorism. So when you're paying your zakat, much like tithing in the Christian community, because the amount that you give for zakat is factored, and they had this in the legislation by fiqh principles, and they even listed the main madhahib, the schools of Islamic jurisprudence. They could say that that was a Sharia action, which also then becomes a possible terrorist action. So they had all of this intent to weaponize the law against the Muslim community. And the way that I did a coalition to go against it is I first went to libertarians who hate forfeiture and who tend to always want to limit government and are very wary of government overreach. Once I had secured that, I was able to convince the Democrats, who were so out of power, being that there is a Republican trifecta and a vast majority of Republican elected officials, that they got on board for the moral voice. And then finally, I was able to talk to Tennessee's business conservatives who often have friction with the social conservatives because of the consequences of the social conservatives' actions on business. So, for instance, when they tried to pass the original anti-Sharia legislation in Tennessee, the activists there before me did a fantastic job fighting it. But the result was many of the top technological and educational talent didn't want to come to Tennessee because they felt that the environment would be hostile for them. So these are like black and brown students and IT and medical professionals who suddenly were not moving into Nashville and other metropolitan areas in the state of Tennessee. And so the business-minded conservatives remembered that. And I was able to show not only how that could be reenacted with this forfeiture of assets in a case of terrorism bill, but I was also able to speak to them on, because there was no thresholds and no safeguards, you could actually create a situation where a church had an active shooter, had a Klan member who went through and then committed a hate crime or some kind of violent act, and it could be called terrorism, and then the church's assets would also be at risk. So because of that coalition of business-minded conservatives, libertarians, and social justice-oriented Democrats, we were able to challenge the legislation while it was in committee hearing, getting it rewritten multiple times to the point where they had protections written into the law that satisfied us. And we went from opposing the bill to actually endorsing it. And then the very next year, we did a control find replace in Microsoft Word and took out the word terrorism and reintroduced the bill for hate crimes. It didn't get past the first reading, but it did send a kind of shot across the bow of anti-Muslim activists, and basically set down for a couple of years that they had to rethink and didn't introduce anti-Muslim legislation for a while. And this is the type of activism that only experience and coalition work and having a broad group of very smart people to advise you can come to. So I want to emphasize again that local politics, especially at the state level, becomes one of the best opportunities in this kind of time of political realignment for Muslims to become active based on just that example alone.
The issue of foreign wars, Trump, whether or not it's sincere, he certainly presented himself both times as the anti-war candidate. They want to blame people for switching to Trump instead of looking at how many of their base stayed home, because if they looked at that, they'd have to reckon with what they did to not get their base out. So going back to the issue of Palestine, I remember during his debate with Joe Biden lied and said that only Hamas want to keep fighting, Israel wants to stop fighting. And Donald Trump is like, what are you talking about? Of course, Israel wants to keep fighting and they should finish the job, which is this phenomenon I like to call who said it, Trump or Chomsky, which is when Donald Trump says something that Chomsky could have said, like calling out Israel for wanting war, except the takeaway is different. Or the same thing with, of course, we want the oil in Syria, or of course, we're not going to sanction Saudi Arabia over Khashoggi because they just bought a bunch of weapons.
And so this is sort of running a quasi 2016, 2020 campaign in a 2024 space. And to point that was made, a lot of people echoing Donald Trump are asking, well, why are we spending money on something that I don't agree with? A lot of tax money, billions upon billions of dollars. And I don't like my public school. I've got potholes in my street. Affordable housing isn't here.
Okay, so I just want to talk very quickly about the themes of those two clips. This is taking Trump's rhetoric and using it and having it just kind of exploring and exposing its impact on people who may not be MAGA, people who actually have a totally different perspective, like the Trump or Chomsky quote, which is both hilarious and also accurate, because people who are very concerned about the Gaza genocide are hearing things that Trump says, even when he's being full-throated, and they still seem more hopeful than what was being offered by the Biden-Harris and then the Harris-Walz campaigns. And right now I'm speaking to the liberals who are so angry at the Muslim community for not just getting in line and voting for Kamala. There's so much more to this that we can get into, but this video is getting a little long, so I want to continue forward and move along.
My worry from the beginning has been the political strategy, if I can call it that, behind some of the Muslim and Arab American groups who came out and endorsed Jill Stein or said abandon Harris. A lot of them were telling me that if Harris loses, she'll be forced to listen to us. We will have leverage. And I said to them, that's not how the Democratic Party works, unfortunately. They don't move to the left after they lose, they move to the right.
Now, again, as smug as sometimes Brother Mehdi is, he's 100% right, and we've seen that already. There is a little bit of pushback happening amongst the Democrat Party, but I saw in another clip, I forget who said it, but they basically said that the consultant class never has accountability because they pick the direction, they pick the strategy, and win or lose, they already get paid. And then the next election cycle, the very same people who architected the outcome are back in doing it again. So they're like failing upward. And that's why I think it's unreliable to think that you can take what's called a punishment only strategy, because these parties tend to have priorities that aren't always reflected by the voters, and definitely not reflected by marginalized people and their concerns.
If you notice in the campaign against Jamal Bowman, they didn't mention Israel. They didn't talk about support for Israel. Why? Because they knew that if they talked about Israel, it would be an election loser amongst the constituents in Jamal Bowman's district.
This is also incredibly important, this idea of messaging and being sophisticated and using nuance. In the last video, I had talked about how there was a mistake made when doing the calculus on taking credit for the Muslim vote, and this whole idea that if you can defeat Kamala Harris over the genocide in Gaza, that you defeat the Zionist lobby. And the mistake was that it was a primary, and the outcome of that primary, which AIPAC and the other Zionist lobby groups have already spent their money and already got their result. By the time November 5th came out, they had already silenced the voice. But here's a very important piece of nuance that Brother Sami brings up that shows kind of the game. and gives us a point of inflection to reflect on and learn from. They understood that going hard on Israel during the genocide wasn't going to resonate with the district. So what they did was they targeted Jamal Bowman to get rid of him, but they didn't use uh, Israel as the main factor for the voters. They talked about local issues. And that just reinforces the point that I was trying to make, that Muslims really need to get civically engaged at the local level.
Look at where they spent their money. Just look at where the campaign spent their money, what their messaging was. No one was talking about the economy in the last 10 days of the campaign. No one was talking about immigration, like once in a while.
Now, this is another mistake I wanted to point out. When we try to prove that Muslims were responsible for defeating Kamala Harris, a lot of times we're using evidence that isn't directly relevant to the case we're trying to make. So by saying, for instance, that the effort that campaigns made in outreach in the final days to the Muslim community is proof that the Muslim community punished or caused the defeat of Kamala Harris, uh, it doesn't follow logically, because we don't know what the outcome of those efforts were. And then here, it's just kind of not true. I mean, it might be true if you're in a very niche community and you have kind of a closed circle of what you're seeing and being exposed to. But at a national level, absolutely not true, as we're about to see.
One of Donald Trump's ads, one of his closing ads here in the final 20 days of the election, 30-second ad, the title of the ad, Global Chaos.
Of illegals, skyrocketing prices, global chaos, and Kamala wouldn't change a thing.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind.
Nothing will change with Kamala. More weakness, more war, more welfare for illegals, and even more taxes. Only President Trump cut middle-class taxes, and only President Trump will do it again.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Now, I chose that clip for a reason, because it was the most charitable to the case that Imam Tom was making. It started off with missiles from Iran landing in Israel, and then it went to global war, which also kind of harkens to Ukraine. So the genocide wasn't mentioned at all. It was protecting Israel, and then the idea of being anti-war. And it definitely did talk about economics and immigration. Now let's see what Kamala's final ad was.
So that's one of the closing ads from Donald Trump. Let me give one of the closing ads from the Kamala Harris campaign. This, again, 30 seconds. The title of this one, Enemies from Within.
Donald Trump, more dangerous, more erratic than ever before.
Echoing fascists.
The worst people are the enemies from within. The enemy from within are more dangerous than Russia. We have some very bad people. It should be very easily handled by the military.
I do remember the day that he suggested that we shoot people on the streets.
Second term would be worse. There will be no one to stop his worst instincts. Unchecked power, no guardrails. If we elect Trump again, we're in terrible danger.
That ad from the Harris campaign.
Now, important to notice here that right now, as we speak, there's discussion on how to use the military for mass deportations. So this isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. And then also, this whole idea is everyone's calling him a fascist and a dictator. But you recall earlier, I showed the clip of Joe Biden promising to make everything as smooth as possible and to give Trump everything he needs. And then all the other people who have led this onslaught against Trump and his movement are, now that Trump is elected, kind of bending the knee or positioning themselves for ratings. So again, that's why there's so much mistrust in the media. But the reason to note that is that that means your one-on-one relationships, the dawah that you can do, the outreach that you did in the past to change the Overton window, to get people exposed to the genocide, to get people to sympathize after they saw the horrific images coming out of Gaza, that has to keep going. We can't go back to sleep just because the election is over.
Dear brothers and sisters, when we speak at these conventions, when we speak at these conferences, too often we talk about changing the narrative, not enough about actually changing ourselves. Too often we talk about improving our image and not actually improving who we are as a people. And in the process of that, of trying to construct an image that's acceptable to the establishment, acceptable to those who want to see our religion watered down until it's no longer what it stands for. In the process of trying to construct that image, we're losing ourselves and we're losing our purpose.
I like that clip not only for what Sheikh Suleiman is saying, but also because I want us to be reflective of how we present. For instance, no one who looks at me, very few people understand or would get the idea that the fact that my mother is Mexican American, um, I'm very white presenting. And so as we start to reach out, we start to build relationships, we start to get active, especially at the local level, we have to be cognizant of how we use our voice, how we use our own privilege, and how we uplift the voices of people who are from oppressed and marginalized communities. Sheikh Omar Suleiman happens to be Palestinian, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to feature that clip. But I have another clip for you that's incredibly insightful. Let's get it.
Civic engagement is getting involved in the process of actions and things that will help better the lives of people, that will help people live better lives in a locality. That is civic engagement. So we understand that the Muslim in general, and in specific even, the one that lives in America, should take part in getting involved in things that help people's lives.
Exactly. And I want you to understand that clip is also from Yaqeen Institute. Sheikh Omar Suleiman is the founder and kind of lead person at Yaqeen Institute. But Sheikh Abdullah Oduro, who was the speaker just now, is a researcher and a presenter there. But the idea here that I want to emphasize on, because one of the first clips I played was from ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. This was a co-sponsored video with them and uses data from them, but almost 6 years ago. So there are Muslim institutions that are community funded and have outstanding track records that we should be uplifting, supporting, working with, and building new ones to complement. So let's get into the last couple of clips and finish this video off.
Imagine some people have dogs with the shock collar. You get to a certain thing and it shocks them. We are establishing a shock collar for politicians that they go beyond a certain line and they get shocked. And if we have to do it to every single one of those dogs, do it.
All I'm going to say to that is, inshallah, God willing, one day. But until we get there, we have to then be very crafty, very smart, allocate resources intelligently, and then embrace the yes and approach. I think it's a complete waste of resources if we are fighting amongst one another too much, or we're tearing down organizations and structures that we think maybe there wasn't a strong ROI on, but still has access to people. I think we have to utilize every different group possible to the maximum that they represent.
It's one thing to have knowledge. It's another thing to have wisdom. It's one thing to know everything that's written in the world. It's another thing to manifest it. And that's why I think for those non-Muslims who are watching, because I realize you have a large non-Muslim audience, it's like when Gandalf says, the world is not in your books. The world is out there.
I want to give Brother Sami the last word because I've been taking I feel bad about it, shots at inaccuracies I see. I think for the record, they have to be corrected so that we have a stronger strategy and a stronger performance as a community. But I also want to make sure that, again, as I preach this yes and approach, that I don't come across as being only critical of our shuyukh, our imams, our students of knowledge, because they're all doing their best and they're all bringing incredible benefit to the community. So whether we see a flaw, whether we see some kind of disagreement, whether we see just a different strategy preference, it shouldn't be in any way outside the ethics of disagreement. And it should only be that we uplift one another and for the common good of the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim community, as well as being a First Amendment community in the United States, being a community that is a community of benefit to everyone.
Because when you go out there, you realize that da'wah is inherently social, political, economic, because da'wah is human. And we are humans with hearts and with fitrah. And I think as long as that is the case, and as long as Allah is there upon high, I have faith in humanity. I have faith that people can be guided from darkness into light. Because it is that faith that I believe will help to ensure that I myself die as a Muslim, because I appreciate that to be Muslim is not a right granted to me. It is a gift that Allah gave. And when Allah gives you a gift, you show gratitude. And the way you show gratitude is by giving adhan to the world and giving the da'wah and say, I have something beautiful here. You should have it too. And you should love the people the way you want them to love you.
Okay. I just want to conclude by saying we have to be a movement based on what Brother Sami said. It has to be based on love. First and foremost, based as the Muslim community on this concept of Tawheed, the oneness of God, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then from that embrace of God's unity, everything should flow, especially the concept of justice and the concept of bringing good to the world. And we're going to get into future videos about how to get involved civically, the nuances and things that we're going to face when we first show up at places that we're unfamiliar with, and how to then not only represent our community well, but represent our community in the role that's appropriate for us, how to leave lanes open for other people, how to empower other parts of our community, how to avoid gatekeeping, how to break down gates that are kept by Muslim activists who may not always have the larger picture in mind, and then how to have some criteria to find out, is our effort being successful or not being successful. So we have a lot to come up with. The future is now, and the future can be bright if we roll up our sleeves. Because again, as a faith community, and especially as Muslims, we have to be optimistic. No matter how dark it is outside, Brother Sami mentioned Gandalf in that same scene in the first video when they're going through the mines. Frodo says, I wish the ring never came to me. I wish I didn't have to live in these times. And then Gandalf says, so do all people who see hard times. But it's not for us to decide, I'm paraphrasing here, what times we live in, but what to do with the times we're given. And I think that's an incredibly powerful lesson. And it's kind of funny that I'm nerding out and leaving this video on Lord of the Rings, but I do want to say, please share this video as widely as possible. I need people who haven't seen it to comment, to give ideas, and for our community to grow so that we can take this experiment and educate one another on how to be civically active, how to start being a community of benefit, and how to do outreach. With that, I do invite all of you to let me know how I'm doing with this video, if it's better than the last one, and if I'm keeping my commitments. And then lastly, after you've shared it, please keep people subscribing. Please keep the new subscriptions coming in, because that'll fuel this channel's growth. And as I work to keep my intention pure, I hope this channel will skyrocket and be a source of benefit. And I'll start to bring in subject matter experts, shuyukh, non-Muslims, and Muslims who all have a similar desire to do good in the world and to explore our freedoms, to explore issues of identity, and then how to leverage diversity and identity so that we can be involved in civics and improve our society. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for watching.